Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Patrick Garrity. We're going to talk about exploited CVEs of 2024 and try and provide some lessons for vendors and defenders along the way. Let me move that a little bit. I work for VulnCheck. I'm a security researcher. We're a CNA. I do not issue the CVEs. But I work closely with our team, our research team, and we're in the security research side, so spend a lot of time with different intelligence organizations, helping get CVE assignment in coordination with them, specifically focus on a lot of initial access and exploitation. And exploitation is what I'll be talking about today. I put this up, don't shoot the messenger. There's CNAs here, which is great. I'm gonna be talking about vendors and products. The intention is to give some examples. There's no reason I picked any of them out, but we're gonna be looking at all the exploited vulnerabilities. So I just wanna be mindful of that, just in general. I'm trying to convey and share data as far as what people need to be thinking about as it relates to exploitation specifically. We really focus on being as transparent as possible when we're talking about exploitation and exploitation evidence. So we're going to hop in to defining that a little bit as far as how we're defining the research itself. I will emphasize too, we offer a free service. You can download all this data. You can go validate our research if you don't believe us. There's references for everything. So I encourage you to do that as well. And it's always great to see other people's research with the exploitation data. As it relates to vulnerabilities, this threat matrix really outlines a view from a threat perspective. And so if you look at the tip of the spear, most of what we'll be talking about today is known exploited vulnerabilities. There's different ways those can get categorized. And specifically, often you see things like ransomware, botnet, threat actor attribution, really as things to prioritize quick, tip of the spear. And then you have known exploitation that doesn't necessarily have attribution as well. So we will hop a little bit into ransomware, but we're going to look at that full dark red and pink triangle. Below that, when we're looking at a threat matrix, weaponized vulnerabilities. So these are typically vulnerabilities in tools like Metasploit, CoreLogic, and other often exploit kits or commercial tools. And then you have proof of concept code, right? And then most vulnerabilities don't have any of these things. Well, I shouldn't say don't have any of these things, but there's not necessarily evidence associated with them. Would be the right way to say that. When I'm talking about known exploited vulnerabilities, I want to make this very clear. I am not just talking about Sysakev. Everything I'm talking about is inclusive of Sysakev. And I will show some like comparisons around that as well. And CISA does a great job. Like they're like this year, even looking like they're kicking off some real intel. We're not, not necessarily seeing other places. So it is one of many sources which I'll talk about regarding exploitation evidence. So great job. How we're defining known exploited vulnerabilities. So we include any vulnerability that we find publicly reported as exploited in the wild. We do this as a free service, API access, anyone can access it. We ask for attribution. But first off, we identify trusted sources. We're very careful of just automating everything that says it's exploited or feeds. I audit feeds a lot of times. My team audits feeds. Large majority of the time, there's a lot of false positives. When we're talking about different known exploited vulnerabilities. Things like not exploited in the wild because it's based on text. And so we automate things that are reliable, that we can. Sysakev is a good example of that. Project Zero, Shadow Server, shout out to them. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then Microsoft MSRC discloses a lot of exploitation evidence on their advisories and especially around Patch Tuesday, which is great. great example of a vendor providing that, and encourage others to as well. In addition to that, we automate collection from hundreds and hundreds of different sources. I will tell you, we get pinged daily. Like this morning, I got pinged on LinkedIn with 4 different reports of exploitation. We ask that everyone discloses the exploitation publicly for a reason. Like, it helps everybody. So it is really cool to see the impact of more and more organizations, researchers, and people doing that. And I get links in my inbox all the time, and you know, really cool to see, so we can help defenders get early visibility into exploitation. Some other important details, like we're really talking about emerging threat. These are things that are coming fast. There's people disclosing known exploitation. So I think of them as emerging threat. The evidence is all public record, so you don't have to trust me. Like, you can go look for yourself if you want. You can do research for yourself. There's a lot of different researchers that have leveraged the data set as well. If there's no CVE, we are a CNA, so we work the best way possible to coordinate getting a CVE timely. Many of the CNAs, we have interacted with you at times with coordinated disclosure. And we work closely with a lot of different intel firms that don't want to be a CNA. Have lots of different relationships there. And if you want to look at our security advisories, you can probably derive who some of those are. There's many different ways people define exploitation. That's fine. I think the whole purpose of what I just said is to help provide clarity in what I'm referring to as it relates to known exploited vulnerabilities. So 2024, from a disclosure perspective, we're talking about vulnerabilities that had exploitation evidence publicly disclosed for the first time in 2024. There's over 800. I did publish a blog at the beginning of the year. We collect evidence continually, and sometimes there's evidence that pops up that's predate, so that's a higher number than what we posted right away. We try and get research out quick, so that's a real reality, and we try and be honest about it. There's over 2,000 known exploited reference citations with this, 100 plus unique sources. And I'm going to hop into ransomware a little bit. There's 53 vulnerabilities with known ransomware. And the dates that we're using for this is when evidence was first published. Now, earliest reported sources, there is some bias in this data as well. Like, 2 things I will point out. We onboarded Shadow Server to automatically ingest 2023. That ran into 2024, so the bubble is a little bit inflated as far as the numbers from that. The other thing is, like, I worked in coordination on some WordPress plugins that had exploitation and did not have CVEs, and with that CNA. So of course, when you do that, that's gonna increase the bubble size of some of these as well. And it's awesome to work with some of those folks too. So I think there was somewhere around, like, I don't know, 62 WordPress plugins that were being exploited, specifically that we work to get CNAs through that have that scope. Sorry, I'm going fast. The one thing I want to point out here is, like, there are vendors disclosing exploitation, which is great. And I think the Sysakev, there's kind of like sometimes a little bit of maybe race condition as far as dates. When you have Patch Tuesday or other things where disclosure happens on the same day. But you know, Microsoft on MSRC discloses a lot. They also have security research, but the large majority of these organizations disclosing exploitation are security researchers, as far as where the evidence is coming from. There are, and I'm not going to be able to name them all, but like, it's great. Google's disclosing exploitation, Apple, Cisco, there's a bunch. And so one of the things I want to do here is, like, really encourage, if you're a CNA or a vendor, when there's evidence of exploitation, it is really helpful for the defenders, because they know it's really important. There's a few different ways you can do this. You can disclose there's evidence of exploitation in your own advisories. You can do it on the CVE record, like often exploited in the wild this date. You see that on a lot of different records, sorry, description. And then if you're using like Vulnogram, or if you even automate this, in Vulnogram, there's a tag for known exploited vulnerability as well. It just provides a discovery. So anyone and everyone can find these things and have the information that this stuff is really important and urgent to fix. So let's take a quick look at some examples of known exploited vulnerabilities. And what I want to talk a little about too is like the information that's flowing. And so I have two examples. They're ones I did last year. I just picked them out of random, but it gives you some idea as far as reporting and information that's flowing. So the first one, this is and I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure this was early 2024. Hopefully I didn't get this wrong. So I grabbed this from earlier last year. But you have an example where very quickly you have someone like Defer Report, which is a trusted source reporting exploitation. You have Shadow Server honeypots now kicking off exploitation. You have GitHub exploits being issued. SANS then comments that they're seeing exploitation confirmed. You have Catalin at Rapid7 on X posting that there's exploitation. So there's just a lot of different sources in January 21st, and then it gets added to Sysakev in this example on the 24th, and there's a due date for the 14th. So this is just a good example of different places, different organizations. FortiGuard, very common with Fortinet disclosing exploitation, Tenable, and Perva, confirming that they're seeing these things and publishing research about it. Another example I want to provide, and I am going to get a little bit into scoring. And so I did outline this one. This is a Microsoft Windows vulnerability. Microsoft issued a vulnerability in June. There's some exploit availability. I kind of mentioned earlier, like weaponized exploits, like Metasploit modules tend to be an indicator that there's likely to be exploitation. There's more public exploits in GitHub. And then this ends up being on Sysakev. I did this one in January, and I'm going to talk about scoring a little bit, but there's some positives here, and then there's just some observations about the score itself. I'm not going to get into how EPSS works, but generally speaking, it's like this is really bad indications that something should be fixed. It does show, like with a new version that was just released a few weeks ago, it got rescored and suddenly it's high. And so I'll talk a little bit more about scoring, but I wanted to just highlight this example as far as exploit availability, weaponization to known exploitation. That's helpful for the defenders so they can take action on. Also, temporal score, 7.8. So we can talk a little bit about scoring in a second. The other thing I wanted to talk about is what can we learn about volume and frequency? And I'm doing a comparison with this, right? So up top, we see all the known exploited vulnerabilities that we have evidence for, and then we have Sysakev. Sysakev is a federal scope. It was not designed for enterprises or organizations in different parts of the world. And so just to emphasize, it's like, it is a great resource. There's real intel coming off that you should fix that stuff. There's often earlier indicators in other places that there's known exploitation. And so there's different processes. But from a capacity perspective, I like to look at, hey, what are we seeing from a disclosure perspective on the exploitation side? Gives you a good example. It's just about every day. You get a few breaks here and there. There's new disclosures of exploitation happening. And on the defense side, that's really important because that helps you capacity plan, because these are typically things you have to respond to quick or fast. If I break that over months, right? I kind of mentioned early on, Shadow Server is popped high, so that's more of an anomaly. But if you're capacity planning, right, we should have some people available. These could be different technologies that run these things down to see if we're impacted and if we're patched, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Usually requires a sense of urgency. Now, the next thing I think about is how do we categorize these things to help people understand where to focus efforts on. So I manually categorize in an Excel spreadsheet But I created, in this case, all the known exploited vulnerabilities and break them down by different categories. And I am, for this discussion, going to like remove some of the data to see the chart on the main stuff, because content management systems, particularly WordPress plugins, are really, really exploited. High target, one of the most pervasive technologies. It's on the internet. You should make sure you have compensating controls. You should make sure your plugins are update. You prune the plugins, all that fun stuff. But I think it's interesting if I take those away. Get a little bit focused intimate on the enterprise organization. And so how I think of these different categories is these are target areas that you should be thinking about, ensuring that you have quick patch processes. They also typically align with different teams across an enterprise organization, and they might or might not be internet connected or user connected. So that's where my mind goes is you have network edge devices, many different technologies, and these vendors will change from year to year. This will be a different set of vendors and number of CVEs, but initial access devices are things you should make sure they're not end of life, they get patched quickly. You have great mitigating controls in place. You have operating systems, so you know patch processes there. Patch Tuesday is great, helps defenders patch broadly. Mitigating controls like EDR. But really, like, yeah, I think it's interesting, like looking at different scopes of categories, like open source software. That's going to be your application developers often that really care about that, and looking at the technologies that have exploitation within that to say, do we have these types of technologies? We probably should ensure we have some sort of process for emerging threat. Ransomware, trying to be mindful of time. And I'll make these all available afterwards, but this is kind of the stuff that goes through my mind to help defenders, think, hey, where do we focus on from a technology perspective, mitigating controls and such. Patch processes. On the ransomware side, as I mentioned, I think I said 52. Sorry, I didn't put it in the notes. But ransomware association is a small portion. And it also a lot of times happens later on in the life cycle. But generally speaking, for enterprise organizations, ransomware is often top concern to organizations from a target perspective. So similarly, like different technologies, network edge devices, initial devices, open source technologies, virtualization technologies, backups, email. You see the content management bubble shrink very quickly. I will say, though, the content management piece I've seen in campaigns like Black Basta, where they're targeting WordPress plugins that have email services, so then they can use that for phishing campaigns, right? Different dynamics to think about as it relates to technology in the Defender stack, if that's helpful to know. I think the last thing I have is I'm going to talk a little bit about vulnerability scoring systems. This is as it pertains to emerging threat. So keep that in mind when I'm sharing this information. But I also think there's some opportunity for improvement for people using different scoring systems. The first thing, if we look at known exploited vulnerabilities, if we look at the severity of known exploited vulnerabilities, the distribution is pretty similar to what you would see when you see all vulnerabilities. What was that? Oh, yes. And this is, I say CVSSB, but these are all exploited. And so you see a distribution of critical, high, medium, pretty normal wheel. Not many low, some no scored, because this is all public scores that we're using. If someone wants to talk about what version, most of it's 3.1, but there is some blended. Happy to talk offline after. And everyone keeps on saying just use BT. Well, does anyone know what that circle looks like when you apply CVSS BT from a severity perspective? It's the same exact thing. This does not help defenders. Like, they're trying to prioritize, and from a CVSS perspective, I think there's an opportunity here to change what we've done for the last 25 years. This also applies to scoring. I've worked on projects on CVSS BT. It marginally moves the needle for top scoring vulnerabilities to prioritize them at the top, but not particularly helpful. So yeah, thanks for calling that out. I think it's an opportunity to improve and change the way we've done it all the time, because it's rather silly that we're signaling defenders to use BT and it really does not change severity for them. It has a marginal impact from a score. And there's lots of other reports on that, but this is real exploited vulnerabilities we're talking about from a data perspective. The other question I wanted to ask is how much EPSS scoring improved with V4 for 2024 KEVs. The exploit prediction scoring system. So here is the, on the bottom axis, x-axis, CVSS, right? And then on the top axis, EPSS. And I have some other slides, but I want to make sure there's Q&A. From me, in the last year, I watched all the known exploited vulnerabilities and looked at all of them, wondering, why are EPSS scores so low when there's evidence of known exploitation? And to me, that's challenging because I've worked a long time in trying to understand and pointing out examples continually. And what I want to know is, it's like, okay, we went a year, we're using this V3, there was a retraining, right? It is 3 to 15 months after the fact of these things actually happening, keep in mind. And if we look at V4, what it tells us is, yes, like with the new model and retraining for last year's vulnerabilities, it made it better. I think there's some things in the work to like retrain more often. It's really hard to see if V4 is any better because we need time like to see and observe to see if it's actually going to catch the stuff over the next year as it relates to known exploited vulnerabilities. But what this tells me is, yeah, that known exploitation evidence was actually real. And EPSS is now confirming that with the training adjustments from a score perspective. And so, you know, really, from an emerging threat perspective and known exploited vulnerabilities, like really, really important for the defender to use every and all evidence as possible. I have a few different considerations from a defender perspective. As a consumer, and most consumers are not intimately knowledgeable on the limitations of scoring systems. Like, this is a real reality. We keep on cheerleading scoring systems to solve problems for our customers. I think there is great work being done to try and improve them over time. Continue that. Hopefully this feedback is helpful for everyone involved in those. I think it's very dangerous if we do not communicate properly the limitations of these scoring systems. From an emerging threat perspective, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I was going to say in here. Yeah, I said proceed with caution. Becoming overly independent, like if you don't have people continually monitoring and analyzing these things to see if they're working properly and help prioritize things, those are real challenges for the defenders. Act on available exploitation evidence, weaponization, and other exploit evidence with a sense of urgency. And then I do highly recommend here, there are great components of CVSS. EPSS has great signal. There's frameworks like SSVC and risk-based prioritization that Chris Madden published that can help you put different components so that you can prioritize things properly. But particularly important, like known exploitation, weaponization, really, really important from an emerging threat perspective to prioritize. Other considerations from an emerging threat perspective, you know, I think a lot about rapid response, internet facing, end users are touching the devices, and users love to click on links. Remotely exploitable. And then I do think that like there's another aspect of this, which is vulnerability debt, right? So most of the time I spent was on emerging threat, but when you're talking about these large swaths of vulnerabilities, ensuring that you're looking at root cause analysis, improving patch management processes, implementing best practices. I know there's initiatives with a CVE program, I think, for end-of-life technology potentially, and making sure you're pruning and removing those. And then ensuring you're getting the right mitigating controls in place. So with that being said, that's the talk. Pop up the threat matrix, and appreciate. I think we have 4 more minutes. Any questions? Let's go.
Hi, so I had a question about the CVSS BT. So I am from Palo Alto Networks. We have started providing both CVSSB and BT scores for our CVEs, I think since Jan or Feb of this year. And we have seen that when BT provides you different ways, right? It says unreported, POC, and exploited. So we have seen, like, for most of the CVs that we publish, there is no POC or it has not been exploited, thankfully. And therefore, there is a 1.5 to 2, maybe even more difference between the B and the BT score.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm trying to ask is, do you think if more providers provide the BT score when it's unreported and POC also, and then you see a difference in the graph that you showed, would that be more helpful?
So what that impacts essentially from a priority perspective is all those 9.8 scores. So it does put those usually at the tip of the spear. So it does have an impact. But after that, if we're looking at all vulnerabilities, right, within an environment, we have vulnerabilities scored down that are being exploited in the wild across, a ton of different distributions. And so I think solely relying on that is very dangerous. Any other questions?
There are no questions in the Discord at this time.
Oh, we have no fans? Thank you. Appreciate
Very
it.
nice. Thank you.